Welcome to Freedom to Learn, the podcast that champions choice in education, defends parental rights, and exposes the harm caused by school unions. I'm Jenny Gentles, Director of Education Freedom and Parental Rights at DFI, the Defense of Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C.
American children are not able to hit the basics right now. And so why are we filling school days with basically everything but, talking for hours about identity politics and big feelings when my child can't read, I think does a real disservice to our kids.
In his inaugural address, President Trump promised to end the government policy of trying to socially engineer race and gender into every aspect of public and private life. He promised to forge a society that is colorblind and merit-based. With the president signing executive orders that seek to loosen the grip gender ideology and DEI have on schools and government, we invited Nicki Neily, founder of Parents Defending Education, to talk with us about what her organization has discovered about the K-12 education system. Nicki founded Parents Defending Education, or PDE, to expose the harmful ideologies woven into K-12 education and help parents reclaim schools from activists imposing damaging agendas. Nicki's also the founder of Speech First, a national campus free speech organization, and she's the mother of 2 school-aged children. Nicki Neily, welcome to Freedom to Learn.
Thank you for having me.
What inspired you to launch Parents Defending Education?
So I actually started working on this in 2020. I was running a campus free speech group at the time, and it was the world shut down because of COVID, and couldn't sue a university. Felt a little bit petty to sue them over free speech violations. And students basically went home for spring break and couldn't go back and get their stuff. And so as all the schools were closing, I had a lot of friends. I'm from Chicago originally, so all my friends are Democrats. And when their schools closed, I started getting messages from people asking, how do I get my elementary school to reopen? I remember thinking to myself, oh, bless your heart, you think they care. But that was kind of an interesting data point to me. And then after that, a few months later, fast forward to George Floyd, and districts started sending out all district emails about that they have been systemically racist, they commit to being anti-racist. And I got more messages from people saying, I think my district just called me a name. Schools used to not insert themselves into politics. And obviously we're in this era now where schools have to insert themselves into totally everything. For me, the thing that really flipped the switch was the Wall Street Journal did a profile of a superintendent in Evanston, Illinois, near where I grew up. And he talked about how he was planning on reopening schools for Black and brown children before white children in the name of anti-racism. And I started yelling at my computer, you can't do that. That's unconstitutional. And that was at the point when I decided K-12 was going to be the next battlefield. This is something I want to get into. And me, in my great naivete, assumed that many school officials didn't know that they were violating students' and families' rights. So I thought, we'll educate some parents about their rights. We'll send some nastygrams from my scary lawyers, and we'll get this cleaned up. Even as I started to kind of build out the organization, I assumed that there was more information out there that we kind of just had to package. But it turns out that when you look at civil rights in education, it usually is in a higher ed setting. So you think about campus free speech. You think about Leah Thomas as a swimmer. You don't think about, can my 8-year-old be compelled to use a pronoun? Can my high schooler be forced to do a privilege walk? And remember, after George Floyd, it was a very heated moment in time where if you said the wrong thing, you were suddenly the neighborhood QAnon person for the rest of your life. And so people were really scared to talk about issues, even if they felt strongly. And so I wanted to sort of meet people where they were. I said, my target audience is Bob in Omaha, who has an associate degree, sees his kid's homework assignment and thinks, this is a little bit weird, but doesn't quite know why, doesn't know what to say, but is unhappy and wants to do something about it. And so just to teach people both what their rights are and then how to engage constructively in the process. And that was kind of where we built it out from.
Your organization is focused on exposing entities and districts that are imposing harmful agendas on schools. I heard you talk about compelling students to use particular pronouns and engage in privilege walks. What are some other examples of activists imposing harmful agendas?
Thinking back to 2021, a lot of it was about race. It was Ibram Kendi. It was Robin DiAngelo. It was privilege bingo. It was affinity groups where students are segregated on the basis of race. I mean, the fact that we still have schools right now and accepted pedagogy that says students learn better from teachers of their own race. I mean, that's the kind of sentiment that would make the KKK proud. And the fact that this is being taught in American education schools today is appalling. We have filed a number of civil rights complaints with the Federal Office of Civil Rights on this issue. We actually filed a lawsuit against a district in Wellesley, Massachusetts in 2021 that was turning away teachers and students from an affinity group that was allegedly to support Asian students in the wake of the Atlanta spa shooting. And just to watch districts do that straight-faced and think not only is this morally right, but this is pedagogically sound is appalling. 2022, 2023, it was a lot of gender, I think largely driven by the Biden administration's foray into their Title IX rewrite, which was recently just overturned. And so we saw locker rooms, overnight field trips, the compelled pronouns. So that really came on with a vengeance. And then sadly, since October 7th, we saw a lot of anti-Semitic incidents in school, and just watching the unequal adjudication of civil rights law in America, to me is, I think, a greater threat to democracy, because I have watched an erosion of trust in the system. If parents believe that their child will not get a fair shake if they make a complaint or they talk to their school because of their child's race, because of their child's sex, our friends can talk about court packing all they want, but if you don't think that schools and elected officials will care about your child based on immutable characteristics, I think that's terrifying. And so just to start to rebuild that over the next couple of years, I think is going to be a huge mandate for the department.
Well, it's important to keep in mind that while these schools are hyper fixating and focusing on dividing students by race and driving a wedge between parents and children around gender and confusing emotionally vulnerable children around gender, and then mistreating in such a horrific way Jewish students through anti-Semitism, test scores have been plummeting. So K-12 students are suffering all around and not receiving the basic education that they deserve. So I understand why you're looking into this, because you want to get rid of all those things so that schools can get back to the basics and do what they're supposed to do, and hopefully do it well. In addition to the lawsuits that you've mentioned and some of these things that you've exposed, you've had quite a lot of media coverage and congressional attention to your work. I'd love to talk about a few of your investigations that have made quite a splash, including the Chinese government's influence in U.S. schools. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've exposed there?
This is something that really just kind of came up out of the blue. A coworker's child went to Thomas Jefferson School for Science and Technology in Northern Virginia. And one of her neighbors had sent their kid to TJ a couple of years before and had kept all of the programs or the annual reports from the Thomas Jefferson Partnership Fund, and gave my coworker hard copies and said, "Isn't this weird? There's a Chinese department store that was sponsoring the school, and it was the $250,000 and up level." And so we started looking into it. We thought, that is weird. And as we started pulling threads, we identified over $1 million that had gone from these Chinese entities to a private 501c3 linked to a public school district in Northern Virginia. Which was very curious, started pulling more threads. You don't have to scratch very far below the surface to find that they're linked to universities and other entities that are tied to the CCP and the Chinese military. And after we flagged this, the district started looking into it, the state started looking into it, thanks to Governor Youngkin. Yeah. And the district, actually, Fairfax County Public Schools, said, just kidding, was actually $3.6 million. We're not doing it anymore, though. And we thought, well, if it's happening here, is it happening elsewhere? And my coworker filed dozens of FOIAs over about a year and identified 143 districts across the country that had been participating in what's called a Confucius Classroom Program. It was a couple of years ago when Secretary DeVos and Secretary Pompeo looked at the Confucius Institutes at the higher education level. They identified that as a problem. This program was trickling down to younger ages as well. And frighteningly, when we put it on a map, many of these were actually around U.S. military bases. And so it started to feel a little bit more than coincidental. And so we flagged it for Congress that held a hearing, looked into it.
Another area that might be of interest to Congress and in future hearings would be a recent investigation that you all did into the DEI grants that have come out of the Department of Education. And maybe that doesn't need a congressional hearing. Maybe it just needs the incoming administration to go in and clean things up. What is it that you all unearthed in that investigation?
We looked into federal grants that went out through the Department of Education under the Biden administration over the past 4 years. And my amazing coworker, Ryan Staley, identified over $1 billion that went out towards DEI-linked programs, hiring, things like that. That's money that when you think about the federal government giving out money, he who pays the piper calls the tune. And so you look at both how the proposals and the grant programs are written, and then you think, all right, a district has to look at those programs, write a proposal, submit it to the department, and then have something approved. And so I think really it shows that the whole program is kind of rotten top to bottom. But the fact that this volume of money was going out at a time that, Americans are facing record inflation, have any of these programs that the federal government, the Department of Education, were funding in these districts made children smarter? Has it decreased learning loss? Has it improved interpersonal relationships? Absolutely not. There was a great study that came out recently from Network Contagion Research Institute that did a kind of a meta-analysis of DEI programming. And it showed, surprise, surprise, that it actually worsens interpersonal relationships. It makes people more suspicious of each other. It makes them more critical of perceived oppressor groups. Why are we affirmatively funding programs that are encouraging students to dislike and mistrust each other? That's not what I send my kids to school for. We then followed that up with looking into the Department of Justice's STOP grant program. That's a grant program that's supposed to be used to increase and bolster school safety. That also was used for a lot of DEI initiatives, things like social emotional learning and restorative justice. I mean, in one case, there was one state where there was knitting circles and yoga. I mean, again, my children need to know how to learn in school, and I want them to be safe in school. And that's what you think these programs will be used for. And for it to not is a real slap in the face to parents and taxpayers.
Well, I have to say I'm very pro knitting and pro yoga, but I hear what you're saying. This probably shouldn't be happening in the K-12 school system.
Certainly not with school safety funding.
Let's talk a little bit about social emotional learning. You've alluded to it a little bit. What's going on there? What has Paris Defending Education found about the role of SEL?
Of course, we all want kids to be kind to each other, but there's been a real shift in the field over the past couple of years into something called transformative SEL, where it's trying to redirect and sort of renegotiate how children interact with each other. And this is largely the lens through which a lot of the identity politics are being pushed through. It's encouraging children to view both themselves and others through the lens of identity politics first, treating others based on immutable characteristics like race, like sex. And that's not programming that we need right now. I mean, yes, I want my kids to be nice, but also, that is not necessarily the role of a school to get very into those things, right? I mean, again, you have our children for 7 or 8 hours a day. And I really want most of that time to be focused on making up the learning loss from when schools were closed, but also just mastering basic subjects, not talking about feelings, not wallowing, not kind of doing that navel gazing. I don't want children to, view themselves as victims. And that's sort of where we're seeing a lot of these programming, create negative consequences because they are sort of looking at the world through an oppressed matrix and sort of the different categories of who is or is not in a dominant power structure type thing. And that's, again, just not what we need our kids to be focusing and spending their money or their time on in schools. And I think there has been a school of thought where some people have thought kids can't learn until their heads are screwed on straight. And then there's another school of thought that thinks, well, if kids are learning, then that actually helps them with their self-esteem and to learn, and things like that. And so, which side is kind of putting the chicken before the egg? But even, thinking about the mental health interventions, we as a country are spending billions of dollars every year on student mental health. But I don't think parents have been paying a lot of attention into how that is being provided and who is providing it. Is it through school-based health centers? Is it through parental exclusion policies? I mean, why would we, if we're worried about kids, feeling confident and feeling assured, why would then a school turn around and tell a child, your parents might not love you because of your gender identity. Let's keep secrets from mom and dad. I mean, what could be worse for a young child's mental health than to encourage them to lead a double life and tell them their parents don't love them? I mean, the fact that that's being done to our kids with our money behind our back is a real slap in the face.
Well, you mentioned billions of dollars, and people might think, Nicki, you're exaggerating billions, but the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act literally pushed billions of dollars into the school system in order to fund more mental health activities, and grant programs continue to come through the U.S. Department of Education out to the states and the school districts to increase pipeline of SEL trained mental health providers that are going to show up in the schools full of ideas about gender ideology and the ways that parents can be enemies to their own children. So we do need to keep an eye on those billions of dollars that have been coming from the federal government. So we've been talking about kind of the negative stuff, the bad stuff, but your organization doesn't exist in order to just stir things up about the bad things. You have a goal to create healthy, non-political education environments again. One huge resource that you all offer are polling, and there was a recent Paris Defending Education poll that found that 90% of parents agree that focusing on core subject areas such as math, reading, writing, science, and social studies would improve the quality of public education. They want healthy, non-political education environments to educate children. Are there other ways that you would describe that environment that you're aiming for?
Even pre-pandemic, children were not performing very well in schools. How can we, as a country, compete in a global environment, in a global economy, if our children are not able to, be proficient in math and reading and science and things like that? So I think that's a huge concern. And I mean, 90% is huge. I mean, it spans, when you dig into the crosstabs, it spans racial lines, it spans political lines. Like, this is not controversial. Like, we send our kids to school to learn and we expect them to be safe. And it's really kind of not happening right now. I mean, to see districts, rather than address violent incidents or drug overdoses, say, we're going to give the kids Narcan. I mean, you're treating the symptom, not the cause. So what exactly is going on here? Because it turns out that maybe, doing these restorative singing kumbaya things and it's not dissuading bad behavior. And it's preventing other children from learning in the process. And so as we watch after George Floyd, the removal of many school resource officers from many schools, they're being put back in now to try and restore order so that some of these kids actually can focus on what they need to focus on. You and I both know the best path out of poverty isn't education. And the students who are being hurt the most by a lot of, not only the bad teaching, but also the bad policies are those children who need a good education and a path forward. And they're not getting it, unfortunately.
Yeah, good education in a safe environment. Like, let's just do that. It seems like a straightforward thing to ask, but we have entities like the ones that are advocating for these federal programs out there creating unhealthy environments. And one of those very powerful entities would be the teachers' unions. So we know that the NEA, the National Education Association, is prepping for war against the incoming Trump administration. What role do teachers' unions play in imposing harmful agendas?
You think back over the past couple of years to the NEA and the AFT's annual summer conferences, you look at the list of their resolutions when they used to publicize them, now they don't. But they're focused on pretty much everything except student achievement and quality. They are focused on abortion. They're focused on Palestine. They're focused on foreign relations. I mean, they're interested in their money and their power. They're not interested in our children. My grandmother was a teacher. My aunts were teachers. This is not the teachers are bad. It's the leadership that is rotten, that has been driving so much of this. And they've been throwing their own members under the bus as well. On the restorative justice policies that the National Association have been pushing, that puts their teachers in danger. I'm optimistic that over the next few years, we'll be able to continue exposing this, because this is something where, they have blocked reforms at every effort. The collective bargaining contracts that are put in place. I mean, we just saw one from Minnesota where the white teachers are going to be able to be fired first. I mean, you were hiring and firing and encouraging that based on skin color.
I think people sometimes think we're exaggerating when we talk about teachers' unions, or they just tune it out because they think, oh, well, I like my third grader's teacher. She's wonderful. Well, we're not talking about her. Like you said, we're talking about the leaders, and we're not exaggerating when we say that they don't prioritize the actual education part of K-12 education. They focus on everything else. So if you look at the leaders' speeches during those summer conferences that you mentioned, Randy Weingarten from the American Federation of Teachers, Becky Pringle from the National Education Association, their speeches did not mention learning loss, chronic absenteeism, discipline issues that are plaguing teachers and creating very difficult environments for them day after day. So we're not exaggerating. Pay attention to what we're saying when we talk about teachers' unions.
And taking money, deducting their dues from teachers' salaries. Teachers are not even really aware of what their dues are going towards. Teachers should be able, to decide what politician they wanted to support, not have it go towards, 99.99% towards the Democratic Party.
All right. So we have an incoming administration, Trump 47, and I'd love to know your thoughts on what you'd like to see happen.
I think there's sort of two buckets of work that have to be done. There's the pulling out and dismantling the bad, and then there's rebuilding the good, both of which are enormous tasks because there has been a huge amount of damage that has been wrought, and there's really low trust in the system for good reason. And so I think, as we saw from President Trump's inauguration speech, addressing some of the gender issues in school is something that was a top priority for families during the election, and is a promise that he plans to deliver on. And so there's the compelled speech aspect of the pronouns, there's sports, there's things like that we're going to watch I suspect that there's going to be a fair amount of resistance from some entrenched school officials. So I think there's going to have to be a lot of follow-up to make sure that that is actually being addressed in a way that is appropriate, that comports with the law. I have been really worried personally about, as I said very early on, this unequal adjudication of civil rights. We believe, as President Trump said, in a colorblind society that treats everyone equally before the law. It is rebalancing the scales of justice. And so to the extent where we're going to start to see investigations and reminders sent to schools, both at the K-12 as well as collegiate level, you may not admit people based on skin color. You may not treat people differently based on their sex. Just little things like that, where it's really going to sort of refocus what schools, how they have been treating students. Focusing these grant programs on what are the evidence-based programs and policies that help students learn. We have watched through this past Department of Education, their non-binding guidance letter that they sent out on the non-discrimination in student discipline. There really was a wink, wink, nod, nod. Wow, if your statistics show that you're disciplining students at different races at different rates, we're going to assume that you're racist, and that gives us grounds for an investigation. That means that in practice, school districts are not disciplining certain students who deserve it because they are fearful that it'll trigger the numbers one way or another. And that's how we ended up getting Parkland. Nicholas Cruz had been flagged as a problematic student, and the school didn't do anything about him. And so those are decisions that are best made at the local level by people who know what's going on, not set from Washington telling people, we're going to look at your numbers and it'd be a real shame if something happened to you. It feels like the mafia. And so just to get back to common sense policies is something I'm really excited about.
People tend to forget that a president can't come in and just wave a magic wand and implement all of his, or in the future, her policies. There's this whole other branch of government, legislative branch and Congress. And so we'll see what happens as President Trump comes in and his Secretary of Education is confirmed, what can be done through administrative action, and then what needs to be done with Congress. So what, from a PDE perspective, are you hoping to see Congress do, either to work with the Trump administration or on their own legislatively?
For Title IX, there has been this tremendous whiplash over the past couple of years. There were the DeVos rules, and then they were undone, and then there were the Biden rule, right? And so it's just this back and forth it's been really enervating. So I would love to see Congress scaffold, add a little bit to that language, because as we saw, there are bureaucrats that will take the 37 words of a statute written in 1972 and totally reinterpret what the word sex is in a way that really undoes the original intent of that law. And so I think that's something that's going to have to be cleaned up. We've seen great action from Congress on just transparency and oversight of foreign funding in schools, which is also something I'm interested in. Increasing the transparency and knowledge and that parents have access to is going to be something that's really important. I would love to know what my kid is learning and not have to pay. We at PDE have spent tens of thousands of dollars over the past several years related to public records requests to get access to lesson plans, to get access to curriculum, emails, kind of interaction, how teachers and faculty talk about students and families. Things like that are really surprising. What is the decision-making process in some of these institutions? How did these policies get adopted? We at PDE have been tracking what we've been calling parental exclusion policies for the past 2 years. And we have identified over 1,200 school districts and counting across the country where school boards have affirmatively voted that you as a parent do not have the right to know your child's gender identity at school. Ginny, you and I are moms, and we have to sign permission slips for sunscreen, for aspirin, but you will transition my child behind my back. You will give them a clothing closet. You will support them and tell them to live a double life. It's kind of mind-blowing what schools think they are entitled to get away with. And so just really to make very clear, no, this is a two-way street. When I was growing up, it was a partnership between schools and families. And to have watched that fray into an adversarial relationship over the past several years is something that is so arrogant and condescending. And I think just really to make it clear, using the bully pulpit as well as congressional action to say, you may not do this. You may not do this to families. You may not do this to the kids. Families are the smallest unit of government there is, and we respect that.
Well, one way to make sure that schools respond to parents' needs and also allow parents who are experiencing those secrets and those aggressive transitions of their children, or just cultures that they're not comfortable with, is to support expanded educational options, support school choice policies. Are there things that you would want to see on that front from the administration or Congress?
We'll see how the federal school choice bill moves going forward, but I think there's tremendous opportunity to have an incoming administration that is actually supportive of families is something that feels like revolutionary. And what I love about President Trump and soon-to-be Secretary McMahon is that they actually know who the customers are in this situation. Linda McMahon is a highly successful businesswoman who built a multi-million-dollar corporation, giving her customers what they want. And they view the education system as the families are customers, parents are customers. Whereas I think what we saw under the Biden administration, under Secretary Cardona, is unions and activists were the customers. They were able to get what they wanted. They were able to get the money, and we were way in the back. We were absolutely not a priority. They actually didn't care about our voices at all. Support for school choice, support for different options. Again, this is something that spans racial lines, spans political lines, because what we saw, so many parents had a front seat to their children's education during COVID. And I think many parents didn't fully appreciate until then that children have different learning styles. Their needs are different. I mean, even within the same family, my son learns very differently than my daughter does. And so they need different kinds of support, different kinds of programming. And far too often, the public school system is a one size fits all. And children deserve better. And our kids don't have forever to wait. I mean, right now, I have a child in 4th grade and a child in 5th grade. I can't wait 15 years for the public school system to get better. I need change now. I need to put my child in a better environment now. Be it safety issues, be it learning issues. Families deserve better options that are, and access to that, because wealthy families have always had school choice, right? They could move to a different place. They could put their child into private school. It is really the disadvantaged families that have really been stuck. And I think to condemn families to a life of poverty based on their zip code is unconscionable. So I'm so excited for an incoming administration that realizes that and is planning to take the action on that.
And we'll see what happens in Congress, but we certainly have seen a lot of support for a federal proposal, specifically the Educational Choice for Children Act from past Congresses. Our final question, I wanted to make sure folks were aware of the polling. Tell us a little bit about the Parents Defending Education polling and the insight that some recent polling has provided into what Americans, especially parents, want from K-12 schools.
They want schools to actually focus on core subject areas, which is, surprise, surprise. Parents support reducing the size and influence of the U.S. Department of Education. As we have seen with these grant programs, or frankly, other just ways that the Department of Education interacts with state and local education agencies. He who pays the piper calls the tune. I mean, we watched the Biden administration try and blackmail schools into adopting their Title IX interpretation because they threatened to take away school lunch funding through the USDA. I mean, what could be more reprehensible than literally taking food out of the mouths of poor children to advance a gender agenda? It's jaw-dropping that they actually pass muster with anybody. Beyond that, they want states to have more flexibility. I mean, things and policies that somebody in Oklahoma might want are way different than in Vermont, and that's okay. I mean, this is something, education is fundamentally a state and a local issue, and it should be responsive to what communities want. There's broad-based support for very common sense reforms like that, where it's not the federal government looking over every teacher, every principal, and saying, do it this way or else.
How can people find out more about Parents Defending Education's polling and investigations? How do we follow your work?
Our website is Defending Ed. And so that's where all of our investigations, our materials are. We have guides for parents just for them to kind of get to know how the system works. I think it's translating wonk into English. We have a tip line, so people send us tips from across the country. And we also file hundreds of public records requests every year just to chase down different interesting threads. And then we try and teach families how to engage constructively with the system, how to file their own civil rights complaints, how to write a letter to the editor, just because at the end of the day, we need families to clean up their own backyard and to kind of watchdog what their school officials are doing. I think it's been so great over the past couple of years just to watch all these families come out of the woodwork because they realized during school closures, the only people who care about their children are them. It's the parents. These bureaucrats didn't have our children's best interest at heart, but you as a family, you do. And so just to teach people how the system works and then how to affect change.
Nicki, thank you so much for your partnership as we work together. the two of us and also our organizations. And thank you for your commitment to education freedom and parental rights, and for joining Freedom to Learn.
Thank you, and thank you for DFI for everything you guys do.
Freedom to Learn is a production of the Defense of Freedom Institute. You can learn more about DFI at dfipolicy.org. If you have feedback or suggestions for future podcasts, please reach out to us at podcast@dfipolicy.org. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and leave a rating and review wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts.